morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Nick Wyatt, as Gemma just said. I'm going to give a quick presentation on sort of the situation with the global aviation industry's recovery, and then move to a Q&A with Kashif, who's kindly joined us today. So, without further ado, here's the agenda. Can kind of skip this one because Gemma's just done such a fantastic job of introducing us both. But just a kind of a little overview of Kashif and my organizations. GlobalData is a gold standard intelligence provider to the world's largest industries. It has a proven track record in helping thousands of companies, government organizations, and industry professionals profit from faster, more informed decisions. And we have over 4,000 clients globally who use our analytics to make those decisions. And we are a listed company on the AIM exchange in London. Now, Kashif has joined us from IATA, which is the International Air Transport Association, which is the trade association for the world's airlines, representing some 290 airlines, or around 83% of total air traffic. The association supports many areas of aviation activity and helps formulate industry policy on critical aviation issues. For over 70 years, IATA has developed a global commercial standards upon which the air transport industry is built, and its aim is to assist airlines by simplifying processes and increasing passenger convenience while reducing costs and improving efficiency. So what I wanted to sort of touch upon today really was the recovery and what we're seeing at this point in time in the aviation industry. It's no secret that it's been a couple of extremely difficult years, but there's a lot to be positive about in terms of the recovery and the pace at which that is currently going. So what we can see here is some data from IATA, which is the system-wide global commercial airlines revenue and growth figures. And what we can see is that there was obviously a very clear impact of the pandemic in 2020, as we suffered from shutdowns, travel restrictions, and all of that sort of thing that went on. It was a real shock, and it was impossible to predict. I think that was one of the key things, that this was impossible to predict. It put many airlines on the back foot as passenger numbers dried up. But due to circumstances that were completely beyond their control, it was nothing that the airlines did or could do to counter it. It was, impositions of restrictions that they simply had to go along with. Some airlines were forced to seek government support to see them through the worst of the pandemic's impact. And we saw this take several forms. In some cases, there were loans. In some cases, there were grants. And in other cases, we saw governments actually acquiring stakes or increasing their stakes in the carriers. As travel restrictions have eased, though, the industry's embarked on a very, very encouraging recovery path. And that's what we see here with the data. So IATA projects that 2022 will actually see system-wide global commercial airlines revenues grow by just over 54%, 54.5%, to reach $782 billion, US dollars, which would represent 93% of 2019's figure. That's an extremely encouraging figure, and that's globally. And there may be some regional differences that we'll discuss with Kashif shortly. And it's a very similar trend if we actually look at the passenger numbers and growth. So rather than just looking at revenues, we can also look at passenger numbers. And we see again, 2021, we saw growth as restrictions started to ease. But 2022 is projected to see real recovery / growth as people show a greater willingness to travel, and also as long-haul trips become more viable and possible again. And that's something that we can see in the sort of the passenger growth in terms of revenue, passenger kilometers. We're seeing a strong rebound in scheduled passenger numbers, which is a very encouraging sign. But what we see is that the year-on-year growth of revenue passenger kilometers is higher than passenger numbers, which suggests that some travelers are venturing further afield. Now at GlobalData, we've developed something that we call thematic intelligence, where we've identified what we feel are the major themes that are impacting different industries, which for my product is travel and tourism. Now, some of these are macroeconomic themes, some of them are disruptive technology themes, and some of them are more industry-specific themes. And you can see here the themes that we have identified up on the screen. And we'll come to ESG shortly, which was a thread that ran throughout the conference yesterday, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. But what I did was, we have lots of different types of data, signals, indicators that we look at through this thematic lens. We can look at patent trends, we can look at job hiring trends, but one of the things we look at that I've chosen to focus on here is company filings. What are executives in the industry actually talking about? So we have a tool that will sort of analyze regulatory filings from companies and look at what it is they are talking about. And this is what the data shows. Obviously, Q3 is not a full quarter, but what we see is that the findings are interesting. These are the top 5, i.e. the most frequently mentioned themes, and we see ESG is very much top of mind at the moment, but we can see that increasing global tensions have led to growing concerns around geopolitics. COVID remains a concern, but is starting to see a drop-off in mentions from executives in filings. And the presence of M&A suggests that companies see opportunities to make strategic acquisitions, perhaps pointing to optimism within the industry. And then finally, and this is something I'll speak to Kashif about in a moment, low-cost evolution features strongly here. Now, it's long been a feature of the European air travel market, and we're now seeing increased adoption of this operating model in other regions of the world. So without further ado, I'll move on to some questions with Kashif. Thank you for joining us today, Kashif.
Morning, my pleasure.
So first of all we've just seen what are some very positive numbers in terms of the recovery of the industry. I'm just keen to get your sort of general views and observations on the figures and whether you see any regional differences. So I understand, for example, that the data for the Middle East and Africa is particularly positive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in our latest industry report, we did say that traffic is nearly back to 80% of pre-pandemic levels globally. If we zoom in on the Middle East region specifically, we're starting to see that for most of the Middle Eastern airlines, that traffic is nearing the 87% mark. So we are approaching a point where we are serving the same destinations with the same volume of passengers as we did pre-pandemic. We are, as a region, subservient to international markets. So while China, Asia Pacific remains closed, that is dampening some of those efforts. But if you look at the traffic currently within the region, not only do we have restored connectivity, but we have new connectivity coming online as well. And we'll touch upon that a little bit later. But in other more mature markets like North America and Europe, traffic has actually surpassed pre-pandemic levels. And not only is that good for passengers, but more importantly for cargo as well, which had become the poster child of aviation when the COVID pandemic struck.
Excellent. And then sort of, we are still though facing some headwinds. We can't sort of pretend that there aren't challenges and that we don't face some sort of turbulent times. What do you feel are the major challenges to recovery and growth beyond recovery?
So for us, I mean, we have a couple of challenges within the aviation industry. Obviously, the geopolitical crisis, not only in the region, but in Eastern Europe as well with Russia and Ukraine, is dampening a lot of spirits. Plus, it poses for a more complex operational environment when airlines cannot overfly or go through very massive corridors or flight information regions. But apart from that, the high energy prices as well as rising inflation is going to be somewhat of a dampener when it comes to the fall season as well. We've had a period of recovery where traffic has grown quite significantly and we're nearing those pre-pandemic levels. But as we head into November, December time, with high inflation rates, high energy prices, it might have an impact on travel looking forward.
Do you see any potential regional differences there when it comes to the impact of inflation?
I think inflation is a global phenomenon. When it comes to the Middle Eastern economies, the likes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE are still growing, some in double digits, but some still quite healthy. And the region has done a great job in terms of differentiating itself from traditional tourism markets. So we do have special events such as the Expo last year in Dubai. We've got the FIFA World Cup coming to the region, but also I know we're going to touch a little bit upon sustainability. We've got the COP27 summit in Egypt this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, and then COP28 in the UAE next year as well. So the region is differentiating itself from traditional tourism business traffic to try and vie for new traffic into the region as well.
Excellent. And then sort of, you just touched there upon obviously the FIFA World Cup that's happening later this year. What are the sort of opportunities and challenges that's posing for the industry in the region?
So I think from a hospitality perspective, all of us are aware of the challenges when it comes to sufficient capacity to be able to host visitors and guests coming into the region. And I think it's going to create for a system within the Middle East, so the likes of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, which in my opinion are almost co-hosts to the event. And that poses its own challenges in terms of how do you get the connectivity into Doha right, so that people that are going to stadiums can commute safely, but with the frequency that's required as well. And with that come the challenges of not only having those extra flights or charter operations, but also harmonizing visa policies so that people that are flying into Doha can get back as well, and they don't need to apply for a new visa. And those are some of the things that the industry, as well as what we've been working on with the governments in the region.
Okay. So for those of you that were here yesterday, there were obviously a number of fascinating sessions that sort of revolved around sustainability and ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And sort of obviously the data I've just shown there from GlobalData's thematic engine shows that that is what executives are talking about most themselves. That is actually the information from their, quarterly and annual filings. So, do you personally see ESG as increasingly mission critical? And what can sort of airlines do to meet standards and targets, and airports as well for that matter?
No, absolutely. So at our last annual general meeting, airlines committed to a net zero carbon emissions program by the year 2050. So all airlines have signed up to moving towards zero carbon emissions. It's a core focus of ours at IATA, as well as the United Nations and ICAO, which is overseeing programs to ensure that the aviation industry looks at reducing its carbon emissions. Just to put things into perspective, aviation as a whole emits less than 3% of global carbon emissions. So while we're a small part of that industry, we are making diligent efforts to try and reduce our carbon emissions by newer eco-friendly aircrafts, whether it's through Boeing, Airbus, and even Embraer. But looking at next generation engines, sustainable aviation fuel is a major breakthrough for us, provided it can come to a cost point which is viable for the airlines to operate sustainably as well. So the industry is moving towards its environmental targets, and there are quite ambitious targets that the industry has set for itself. And the airlines are working, to have more efficient aircraft, more efficient operations, and then use alternative fuels as opposed to conventional jet A1.
So in terms of sustainable aviation fuels, what are we seeing in terms of development, and who's driving it? Is it airlines, airports, or is it actually the sort of fuel companies, the energy companies?
So the short answer, it's all of the above. The airlines are the end users, but the likes of the major oil and gas companies are investing in technology to look at harnessing sustainable aviation fuel. We're quite privileged in the UAE, just up the road in Abu Dhabi. Masdar Institute is working on creating sustainable aviation fuel with their partners for Etihad Airways as well. Okay. And Etihad Airways has been a global leader when it comes to sustainable aviation. They operated the first fully sustainable aviation flight from London Heathrow to Abu Dhabi last year. And it proves that using a combination of SAF as well as efficient operations, such as continuous descent and a more rationalized flight plan, airlines can reduce their carbon emissions to a great degree. But also, not only with those metrics, you can have the reduction of single-use plastics, more eco-friendly material on board, as well as reducing your footprint.
So do you feel that this is being driven more by trying to reach standards and targets, or do you think there's an element of kind of catering to increased consumer demand for more action on sustainability matters?
No, absolutely. I think it's both go hand in hand, really. Consumers are quite aware about their environmental responsibility, but there is a trade-off when it comes to price. But generally speaking, people are quite aware about their responsibility to the environment, and they're happy to commit to it, provided the airline is meeting their needs as well.
Perfect. And that leads nicely on to my next question when you talk about the trade-off with price. One other theme that we saw come up in the filings data there was low-cost evolution. Now, for somebody like myself from Europe, it's a model we're extremely familiar with. It's really embedded in the industry. We've seen excellent success of sort of Ryanair, EasyJet, Wizz Air, those kind of carriers. We're seeing more activity in that regard in other regions. Sort of, how do you see the sort of low-cost carrier segment developing in the Middle East and Africa?
It's been an absolute game changer for the Middle East and Africa region. More opportunity in Africa than the Middle East. But if you talk to me 10, 15 years ago to say LCCs are going to take over the region, many people in the region would have laughed with some cautious optimism. But if we look at the market as is today, the likes of Air Arabia, Fly Dubai, Jazeera, Fly Adil, we've seen a lot of these airlines spring up in the region, and in many cases, they're carrying more passengers than legacy airlines do. If we look at the Kuwait market, or even in Sharjah, Air Arabia has created a new segment for itself within the region. And with the traffic growing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, not only is there room for the legacy airlines or the ones that have been established for a couple of decades, but we're starting to see the likes of FlyNAS and Fly Adil actually pick up a lot of that tertiary traffic, typically traffic that the legacy airlines would not serve. And if I could add, the region has quite ambitious targets in terms of doubling or tripling its footfall to and from these countries. And if I just look at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the last couple of months, we've seen commitments from additional airlines that traditionally would not have served those routes fly from Europe, Far East Asia, the Indian subcontinent to the Kingdom. So not only are we looking at a lot of activity from low-cost carriers, but we're seeing non-traditional route pairs as well in the region.
And so on that note, what are the implications in terms of infrastructure? Are there things that need to be done in terms of infrastructure? Because thinking about how the low-cost carrier model works in other parts of the world, it typically deals with secondary and tertiary airport locations. How do you see the impact on infrastructure development in the region?
There's obviously going to be bearings on the need for airport infrastructure and capital expansion as well. When it comes to governments, they'll need to prioritize whether they focus on the hub and spoke model, like some of the airlines and airports in this part of the world have done quite successfully. But as we see the point-to-point traffic grow, especially in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there will be the need to develop and invest in sustainable infrastructure for airports as well. Typically for destinations where passengers might want to fly direct as opposed to go through Riyadh or Jeddah or Doha, for example. And we're starting to see with a lot of the giga projects that Saudi Arabia is embarking on, each one of those giga projects has its own airport infrastructure bolted on with it. So whether it's the Red Sea, Al Ula, Neom as well, all of those master plans have an aviation component to support the development of those projects.
And do you see any differences between sort of the Middle East in that regard and Africa?
Yeah, no, Africa, in my humble opinion, is a continent with tremendous opportunity. It's traditionally been underserved. You've seen pockets of hub and spoke operations such as in Addis Ababa and Nairobi, and then in South Africa, which has a very well-established tourism market. But there is tremendous opportunity when it comes to setting up new airlines. This is why the likes of Qatar Airways, Ethiopian, and other airlines are looking at setting up regional bases in or on the African continent. And it is a continent that is vastly underserved. And if you look at the likes of international operators such as Emirates, Turkish Airlines, and BA, they do serve a lot of the continent, and it's one of their most profitable operations.
So you mentioned Turkish there, and you and I were having a little conversation before the session today, weren't we, about the sort of the mega project at Istanbul Airport. What role do you see that playing in the sort of the region's travel, and is that sort of an opportunity? Is it a risk as a competitor? How do you view the project there?
So there's definitely competition. We tend to think about the big hubs within the region, such as Dubai, Doha, to some extent Abu Dhabi, and then the growing footfall or traffic within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But just 3.5, 4 hours north of us is Istanbul, which is a very large facility. And Turkish Airlines serves or prides itself on serving more destinations than any other airline. In my humble opinion, I think connectivity is good no matter who's bringing in that connectivity. So whether it's Turkish, Emirates, or Etihad, as long as there is connectivity, it creates economic opportunity and connects people as well. But not only people, it also fosters logistics trade as well.
Okay, great. And sort of finally, sort of an open-ended question, really. Sort of, are there any key trends and/or developments that affecting the future trajectory of air travel or the wider tourism and hospitality sector, for that matter, that you'd like to address for our wonderful audience?
No, absolutely. I think as we emerge from the pandemic, one of the things we've all been accustomed to is the use of technology. All of us go to restaurants and hotels and immediately begin looking for the QR code to scan to get the menu. Similarly, the travel and hospitality industry has moved away from traditional processing to start looking at contactless processing. Within the aviation industry, we're now looking at biometric facilitation for passengers to be able to use their mobile phones, pre-register themselves, and complete all of their formalities for their travel without having to go through the traditional process of checking in, bag drop, immigration, pre-customs or arrival. And I think for the hospitality industry, that's a potential opportunity to leverage off of the aviation industry as well. The same tokens that are being used for airline facilitation can be used for hospitality as well.
So in terms of sort of technological adoption, because as I said, we saw there on the slide, we've identified things such as metaverse, augmented reality, and the things like that go with it. Machine learning, cybersecurity, Internet of Things. There are many, many sort of disruptive technology types that sort of we look at and we focus on and we analyze, and we're seeing huge investment, be it through the development and protection of intellectual property, be it through job hiring of specialists, be it through strategic partnerships where we are seeing airlines and airports sign deals, partnership deals with, specialist vendors and service providers in those fields. One of the things that comes up when sort of I speak to lots of people in the industry is the need, particularly within hospitality, to balance tech with service. Is that something that you see in the aviation industry as well, i.e. not replacing everything with forms of technology?
No, absolutely. At the end of the day, we're essentially moving passengers and goods from one place to another. There's only so much technology can play, but where we are emphasizing the need for technology is where technology can help free up infrastructure to be used more efficiently. So do we have to use airports the way we do, or can those facilities be rationalized for other purposes? And one of the things we're doing is, if we move some of those processes off-site from the airport infrastructure itself, that gives passengers a greater dwell time within duty-free and F&B offerings as well. And ultimately, that revenue trickles back to the government or the airport. Do you really want your passengers to be standing, 10, 15, 30 minutes in security queues or check-in? You give that dwell time to them so that they spend in your duty-free shops as well as F&B offerings so that you get a piece of that revenue. But yes, there is a trade-off between how much technology you can implement, and the trade-off is something that we're discovering. But if we look at the traveler, and one of the things that we do annually is a global passenger survey. Passengers, 80% of respondents have told us they're more than happy to relinquish their personal data if it means they get a better passenger experience both on the ground and in the air.
Do you see any differences there between different markets, different generations or demographics?
Yeah, so I mean, no surprise, North America and Europe tends to be slightly more mature when it comes to digital adoption. Within the Middle East region, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar tend to be at the most mature when it comes to digital adoption. But keep in mind, a lot of our traffic coming into the region and leaving is transfer traffic from the Indian subcontinent to North America, but also on what we call the kangaroo route between the UK and Australia as well. And then we're starting to see a lot of point-to-point traffic. But the young generation is quite tech-savvy. They are used to purchasing their itineraries online, and now they're starting to get creative as to how they purchase ancillaries as well, which is an opportunity for aviation, but also the hospitality industry.
And that really plays in really well, doesn't it, with the low-cost carrier sort of model that we spoke about, because obviously purchasing ancillaries and doing a lot of the check-in process yourself is an intrinsic sort of feature of that model. I guess one other sort of question that I would have around sort of technology is, are there potentially some complexities around different legislatory frameworks, legal frameworks in different markets? With regards to data protection, etc.
3 or 4 years ago, it was a major roadblock in terms of the adoption given regulatory hurdles. I think COVID was a blessing in disguise, just by personal experience. 4 or 5 years ago, when I went to governments to try and get them to use mobile boarding passes or do away with paper, the answer was absolutely no. We have to see the physical stamps. We have to see paper. As soon as COVID struck, all governments moved towards paperless and contactless. So we are starting to see a fundamental shift away from legacy processes. Yes, data privacy and compliance with EU GDPR is an issue, but I think most of the governments in the region, especially the GCC, does an absolutely fantastic job in terms of protecting the data as well as looking at cybersecurity quite seriously.
Excellent. And as you can see, we've ticked into the red numbers here. So just finally, are there any other sort of final opportunities or challenges you'd like to outline?
No, as I mentioned, I think the Middle East and Africa market is one of the fastest growing in the world. From an IATA perspective, we're still going to see a near doubling, in some cases, near tripling in traffic to and from the region, which also means that there is enough room for new entrants to come in, whether it's in the aviation industry or hospitality. And I think governments in the region have now started putting in place measures such as liberalizing visa policies, liberalizing the environment, and creating a platform that is fostering a lot of investment as well as footfall coming in.
And so any particular market, in one word, that you see as the biggest opportunity for connectivity?
Well, I mean, there's not a day that goes by where we don't spend enough time looking at the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So if I had to be bullish, I would say tremendous opportunity. It is going to be one of the largest sites in the world when it comes to construction activity. From an aviation perspective, we're expecting a near tripling of activity. But then again, the fundamentals of the UAE are so strong that the UAE will continue to drive a lot of not only VFR, but business traffic as well. The numbers for Dubai look absolutely phenomenal. And with the investments the government of Dubai is doing, as well as liberalizing the tourism program, I think the future is quite bright.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for those fascinating insights, Kashif. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.